The bus came into Dunmore on a Wednesday, which was not a day anything usually arrived. She was the only one who got off. The driver set her bag on the gravel without ceremony and pulled the door shut before she had finished stepping down, and the bus was already moving when she turned to look at the town. It was small in the way that prairie towns are small, not cramped but exposed, as if the land around it had simply declined with any idea of shelter. One main street of maybe 8 buildings. A co-op grain elevator at the north end, its white paint gone the color of old cream. A hardware store. A post office the size of a garden shed. A diner with a hand-lettered sign in the window that said open but whose interior was dark. And at the far end, set back from the road by a gravel lot, a woodworking shop with its doors propped wide and the sound of a planer running somewhere inside. She had a letter in the front pocket of her coat. She had read it enough times that she no longer needed to. It was from a man named Sutherland. The postmaster had written his name at the top and crossed it out and written it again, as if he'd been uncertain of the spelling, who needed someone to manage the house. 3 days a week. The wage was fair. There was a room if she needed it. He had written that last part as a single sentence, separate from the rest, the way you write something you want to include but are not certain will land well. She had believed him because the letter had no flourish to it. No assurances about what a pleasant arrangement it would be. Just the facts of what was required and what was offered, and a note at the bottom that said the job was still available as of the date written, which was 6 weeks ago. She had written back. He had confirmed. That was the whole of it. The gravel lot in front of the shop was empty except for a truck, the color of weathered cedar, one headlight cracked, and a yellow dog lying in the shade of its rear wheel. The dog lifted its head when she approached and watched her with the particular attention of an animal that has learned to take the measure of strangers without committing to an opinion. She stopped a few feet from it. It put its head back down. Inside the shop, the planer stopped. She heard footsteps on a concrete floor, unhurried, and then a man appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth that had seen too many years of the same work. He was taller than she had expected. She had not expected anything specific. She reminded herself she had formed no picture. With the build of someone who used their body consistently rather than occasionally. His hair was dark with gray at the temples, and he wore it slightly too long, as if the matter of cutting it had simply not presented itself as urgent. He looked at her once, directly, the way a person looks when they are taking in information rather than making a judgment, and then his eyes went briefly to her bag on the gravel and back to her face. "You're the one from Edmonton," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. "Come in. I'll finish up and take you to the house." She picked up her bag and followed him inside. The shop smelled of spruce and linseed oil and the particular dryness of wood dust that settles into the air and never fully leaves. It was orderly in the way that a working space is orderly when the person in it has decided that disorder costs too much time. Everything had a place and was in it, not for appearances, but because the work required it. She stood near the door while he went back to the bench and ran the planer over a long piece of what looked like oak, checking the face with the flat of his hand after each pass. His attention was on the wood. She watched him work and was glad he did not feel the need to fill the space with conversation. After a few minutes, he set the planer down and swept the bench off with a wide brush and hung it on its hook. He turned off the overhead lamp above the bench. Each action was its own complete thing. She found herself cataloging them without meaning to, the way she had learned to read spaces and the people in them, the order of the tools, the way nothing was doubled or redundant, the single coffee cup on the windowsill above the bench clean and inverted. One cup. "Ready," he said, and came toward the door. The truck was not comfortable, but it was solid, and he drove the way he moved in the shop. Without hurry, without performance, the dog had gotten into the truck bed on its own. She could see it in the side mirror, sitting with its nose into the wind, the yellow dog. She had not asked its name. They drove south out of town on a gravel road that ran straight for a long way, and then turned west alongside a shelter belt of spruce that had been planted close enough together that the interior was completely dark. The sky was high and pale, the way prairie skies in late August when the heat has flattened everything out and the color has not yet turned to the deeper blue of autumn. "How long have you been here?" she asked, not because she needed to know, but because the question was neutral and she had been quiet long enough that more silence felt like a kind of statement. 11 years, he said. Came up from Manitoba. She looked at the shelter belt going past. Family? My son. He's in Saskatoon now. A pause. You? No, she said. Then, after a moment, not anymore. He did not follow that. She was grateful. The road curved around a slough, the water low and still, a pair of pelicans floating near the far edge without moving. The gravel popped under the tires. The house came into view around a long bend. A 2-story farmhouse, white, with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front. A stand of caragana along one side had grown tall enough to partly obscure the east window. The garden between the porch and the road had been turned but not planted, the soil dark and loose, already drying out in the afternoon heat. Someone had intended to do something with it and had not gotten there. He stopped the truck and got out. The yellow dog jumped from the bed and went immediately to the far side of the house, nose down. She stepped out and stood on the gravel apron in front of the porch and looked at the house the way she had looked at the town, steadily, taking it in without deciding anything yet. The porch boards were solid. The screens on the windows were intact. The door had a proper latch. These were the things she noticed first. The things that told her whether a house had been maintained from obligation or from habit. And habit was the better of the two, because habit continued even when no one was watching. He held the door and she went in ahead of him. The kitchen was large by farmhouse standards, with a window above the sink that looked out over the backyard and the grain fields beyond. A wood table with 4 chairs, though 2 of them had been pushed against the wall, and had a stack of farm almanacs on the seats. The counters were clean. The floor was clean in the way is clean when a person mops it but does not know quite what to do about the corners. A wood stove in the corner of the adjacent room, not lit. A shelf with a row of identical tins, each one labeled in the same handwriting. She looked at the tins. He had labeled them himself. The handwriting was deliberate, the letters evenly spaced, the kind of printing a person develops when they are working from precision rather than speed. The room's upstairs, he said. End of the hall. You can take it tonight and see if it suits. If it doesn't, there's a motel in Dunmore, the Canalta on the highway. She set her bag down near the door. I'm sure it will suit. He moved to the stove and opened the firebox out of apparent habit and closed it again. I usually eat at 6, he said. But I don't expect you to start tonight. I don't mind starting tonight, she said. He looked at her then in the way he had in the shop doorway, that same direct, informational look. There's a roast in the fridge, she said. From Sunday. It needs using. I'll find what's there, she said. He nodded and went back outside. She heard the truck door and then the engine and then nothing. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. The afternoon light came through the window above the sink at a low angle and lit up the dust moving in the air. The tins on the shelf. The 2 chairs pushed against the wall. The garden outside, turned and waiting. She hung her coat on the hook by the door and found an apron in the second drawer she opened and got to work. She was not cooking for him. She was using what was available on the first night in a new situation, and that was all. She told herself this while she sliced the leftover roast thin and found onions in a wire basket under the counter and a jar of stock on the bottom shelf of the fridge with a date written on the lid in the same deliberate printing as the tins. She told herself this while she lit the gas burner and found the cast iron skillet hanging on the hook above the stove, heavy and well seasoned. She had managed houses before. This was no different from any of them. The yellow dog appeared at the back screen door and sat down and watched her through the mesh with calm, undemanding attention. She did not open the door. The dog did not seem to expect her to. After a while, it simply lay down against the step and went to sleep. He came in at 5 to 6. She heard the boots on the porch step. He hung his jacket on the second hook without looking to see if the first was occupied. It was, by her coat, and washed his hands at the sink, and stood there a moment looking at the skillet and the pot of mashed potato on the back burner and the small dish of pickled beets she had found at the back of the fridge, and set out without thinking much about it. He didn't say anything. He pulled out the near chair and sat down. She brought the food to the table and sat across from him in the second chair, the one that had been next to the wall. She had moved it without deciding to. They ate. The dog scratched at the back door once and then stopped. He was not a person who ate quickly or spoke while eating, and she found she did not mind either of those things. She had eaten enough meals across from people who talked to fill the quiet that she had come to understand the quiet itself was not the problem. The quality of it was the thing. This quiet had weight and texture the way good wood does. Not empty, not waiting to be filled, just present. When he was done, he pushed his plate back a quarter inch. Not away, just back. He lifted his coffee cup and looked at the window over the sink. "The beets are from Morley's," he said. "Down the road, she brings things sometimes. I found them in the fridge," she said. "I hope that was all right." "They were there to be used," he said. She drank her coffee. Outside, the light had gone orange across the tops of the spruce in the shelter belt, and the yard was filling with the particular stillness that precedes a prairie dusk, the air going flat, the birds stopping, the whole landscape seeming to take a breath and hold it. "I'll do the room in the morning," she said. "If you have things you need, I can make a list for town." "Hardware store carries most things," he said. "Co-op for the rest." He turned his cup in both hands once. "Morley's daughter does the mail run on Tuesdays if you don't have a car." "I don't have a car," she said. He nodded. That was apparently all that needed saying on the subject. She slept that night in the room at the end of the hall, which was small and had a window that faced east and a pine dresser with a round mirror mounted above it that was slightly tilted, so that what you saw when you stood before it was your own face at an angle, slightly unfamiliar. The bed was made with fresh sheets, hospital corners. He had done that himself, or had asked someone to do it. She did not know which, and found it did not matter much, only that it had been done. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the house. A farmhouse at night is not quiet in the way a city apartment is not quiet. It is full of small sounds, the expansion and contraction of wood, the wind finding its way under the eaves, the dog settling on its bed somewhere below, the particular tick of a hot water tank doing its work. She catalogued them without anxiety. These were the sounds of a house that was functioning. She could work with that. In the morning, he was already up. She could hear him below in the kitchen. The controlled sounds of a person who is making an effort not to make noise, which is its own kind of sound. She dressed and came down. He had made coffee and left a cup at her place at the table, not poured. She did not know how she took it, but the cup was there, positioned as if a place had been set. He was at the counter with his back to her, eating toast over the sink in the economical way of men who are accustomed to eating alone and have not yet recalibrated. She poured her coffee and sat down. He said, without turning, "I'll be in the shop until noon. There's a list on the counter if you need it." She looked. There was indeed a list, written on the back of an envelope in that same careful printing. Not a list of instructions, but a list of things in the house, where the cleaning supplies were, where the fuses were, where the spare key hung. The kind of list a person makes when they want someone to be able to find what they need without having to ask. She read through it once. She set it back on the counter. She worked through the morning without direction. The house had its logic once she began to learn it, the way all houses do. Where the light fell and when, which drawer stuck, which window let in the cross-draft that cleared the air. She stripped the curtains in the sitting room because they had gone stiff with dust and washed them by hand in the laundry tub in the basement and hung them on the line in the backyard in the early light. She scrubbed the cooktop. She found a mop bucket in the utility room and went over the kitchen floor properly, corners included. Around 10, she heard him come to the back door and pause on the step. She kept mopping. He came in and looked at the floor and said nothing and poured himself coffee from the pot she had left on and went back outside. She found herself listening for the sound of the shop doors. 3 weeks passed in the shape of those first days. She did not measure them as 3 weeks. She measured them in smaller units, which mornings the dog wanted to come in and which it did not, what day the mail ran, when the spruce shelter belt went dark at a given hour, and what that told her about the season. He was in the shop from early until noon, and in the afternoons drove to town, or worked on the outbuildings, or sometimes simply sat on the porch steps with the dog and read, a thing she had not expected of him and did not remark on. He was a reader of specific things. She could tell from what was stacked on the end table near the wood stove: land surveys, A history of the Métis land claims, a novel that had been held open long enough in the same place that the spine had given up. She did not pick any of them up. She was not there to know him. She was there to do the work. She told herself that. One morning, she came down to find that the 2 chairs that had been pushed against the wall were back at the table, all 4 of them now evenly spaced, as though the table had always been set for more than one person. She did not comment on this. She set his coffee at his place and hers at hers and sat down. He was already eating. He glanced up once and then back at his plate. The chairs stayed where they were. On the first day of September, she walked to Morley's farm down the road to return a jar. She had not been asked to do this. The jar had been empty for 2 weeks, and it sat on the counter in a way that had begun to feel like an oversight, and she was not a person who tolerated overlooked things when the remedy was straightforward. Morley was a woman of perhaps 65, with the direct manner of someone who had lived on the same land long enough that small talk had come to seem like a poor use of time. She took the jar and looked at it and set it on the step and said, "How are you finding it?" "Fine," she said. Morley looked at her in the way that prairie women look at you when you have said something that is technically true, and they are deciding how much to press. Then, she said, "He's not easy to read." "No," she said, "he's not." Morley nodded, as if that confirmed something she had wanted confirmed. "He's a good man," she said. "Just takes him time to know what he means." She thanked her for the beets and walked back along the road with the shelter belt on her left and the field on her right, the canola long harvested and the stubble gold in the morning light. A flock of sparrows lifted from the far edge of the field and moved together like a single thing changing its mind. She thought about what Morley had said. She had not been looking for information about him. She had not asked. But she had not asked either. On a Thursday evening in the second week of September, she was hemming a work shirt she had found in the basket at the top of the stairs. The cuff had come undone on the left sleeve, and someone, him, had simply folded that sleeve back and left the shirt in the basket rather than throw it away, which told her something about the kind of person he was. She sat by the window, in the sitting room where the evening light was best, and worked the needle through the cuff lining. He was reading in the chair across the room. The wood stove was going for the first time that season, just enough to take the edge off. The dog was asleep on the rug between them. He turned a page. She finished the cuff and smoothed it with her thumb and held it up to the light to check the line. He said, without looking up from the book. "The thread you've been using isn't heavy enough for that weight of fabric." She looked at the cuff. He was right. "I used what was in the kit," she said. "There's a heavier spool in the top drawer of the dresser in the second bedroom," he said. "It's been there a while." She did not immediately respond. He turned another page. She set the shirt across her knee and folded her hands on top of it and looked at the fire through the grate of the stove. "I'll find it," she said. She did, the following morning. The second bedroom was used for storage. Cardboard boxes, a folded camp cot, a ceramic pot with a crack along the base that had been filled carefully with some kind of compound, but not painted over. The dresser was against the far wall. In the top drawer, beneath a roll of packing tape and a spare curtain hook and a child's spelling primer with a name she did not recognize on the inside cover, she found the spool, dark linen, the right weight. The color was close enough to the shirt's fabric that it would not read as a repair. She stood in that room for a moment longer than she needed to. The child's primer, the camp cot, the box in the corner that had a boy's name written on the outside in permanent marker, the letters drawn large and careful the way a child draws them when they are first learning their own name. She went back downstairs with the thread. The weeks turned. The light changed, not gradually but in increments. The way things change on the prairie where the sky is wide enough that you can see the season moving across it from one edge. The mornings went sharp and the afternoons shortened. The yellow dog started sleeping inside, on a mat near the wood stove, and he did not comment on this change in arrangement, and neither did she. She began to know the house the way she had learned to know houses, not by studying them but by living in them until their rhythms became her own. She knew which board on the porch step flexed under her right foot and not her left. She knew that the east window in the kitchen wept condensation on cold mornings, and that a cloth kept on the sill to the right of the tap was the practical solution. She knew that he came in from the shop at noon and ate standing at the counter if she was not there, and sat at the table if she was. She was always there. One afternoon in early October, she walked to the hardware store in Dunmore for caulking. She had noticed the gap around the sitting room window frame, and winter was coming. She had been in the store twice before, and the man behind the counter, Reeve, someone had called him once, or perhaps it was a different name and she had simply filed it wrong, knew her by sight now, if not by name. She found the caulking. On her way to the counter, she passed the aisle with the household supplies. And there on the lower shelf was a small roll of weather stripping in exactly the color she would have chosen for the back door threshold. She had not mentioned the threshold to anyone. She had only noticed it herself on a cold morning the previous week, the way the draft came under it and moved the mat. She bought the caulking. She did not buy the weather stripping. There was a limit to what she was here to fix. She walked back along the highway with the bag in her hand and the sky above the shelter belt, going the particular pewter color that meant rain, or possibly the first light snow, not yet, but soon. A truck slowed as it passed, and the driver, a man she didn't know, raised 2 fingers off the wheel in the way people do on rural roads. She raised a hand back. When she got home, he was on the porch with a piece of weather stripping and a utility knife, measuring the back door threshold. She stopped at the end of the porch steps and looked at him. He was crouched down, the weather stripping held against the door base, the knife in his other hand, doing the same arithmetic she had done in her head on a cold morning. He did not look up immediately. When he did, he said, "I noticed it was letting cold in," she said. "So did I." He went back to the measurement. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen with the bag of caulking still in her hand and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Then she put the caulking in the under-sink cabinet, where it would be easy to find, and hung her coat and put the kettle on. Snow came in the second week of October. Not the first light dusting she had been reading in the sky, but actual, committed snow that began before dawn and did not stop. She woke to the sound of it, or rather, to the silence that snow makes, the way it absorbs the ordinary sounds of the world and replaces them with something cleaner and more demanding. She lay still and listened, and then dressed and went down. He had already lit the stove and made coffee. His tracks went from the porch to the shop, and back to the porch, and back to the shop again, visible through the kitchen window in the gray pre-dawn light, the snow filling them slowly. He had been out there for some time. She stood at the window with her cup and watched the snow come down across the yard, across the dark shapes of the spruce in the shelter belt, across the empty garden that had been turned and never planted. A cardinal landed on the top rail of the back fence, red, vivid and precise against all that white, and was gone before she had finished noticing it. She thought about the garden. She had looked at it often enough. The soil had been turned in the spring, she thought, turned with intention, and then set aside when something else demanded attention. And then the summer had gone past, and there was nothing to show for the intention except the dark rows of waiting soil. She had not asked about it. She had told herself it was not her concern. But she had looked at it. She heard him come in through the back, the particular sound of his boots on the step, and the way the door moved when he opened it. He came into the kitchen and stood at the sink and washed his hands and reached for his cup without looking around to see if there was coffee. He knew there would be coffee. Somewhere in the last several weeks that had become a thing he knew, she said, without turning from the window. The garden, what were you going to put in? He was quiet for a moment. She heard him set his cup down on the counter. Hadn't decided, he said. Started it, and then didn't. She looked at the snow covering the turned soil, making it even, making it patient. What would grow here, she said. It was not quite a question. Most things, he said, given the right start. Another pause. There's good light on that side in the morning. She did not say anything. Outside, the cardinal was back, or a different one, impossibly red. I'm no gardener, he said, and his voice had something different in it. Not quite an apology, but the register of a man who is saying one thing and meaning something adjacent. I started it because it seemed like the kind of thing a place ought to have. She turned around then. He was standing at the counter with both hands around his cup, looking not at her but at a point somewhere between them. The way he sometimes looked when he had said more than he intended and was deciding whether to walk it back, she did not make it easy for him to walk it back. "I know something about gardens," she said. He looked up. "Not everything," she said, "but enough." He looked at her for a long moment. The stove ticked. The snow came down outside with its particular quiet insistence. The dog, from its mat near the stove, resettled itself with a long sigh. "Spring's a ways off," he said. "It is," she said. She turned back to the window. She picked up her cup. Outside, the snow went on falling, smoothing and softening, and covering everything with a kind of deliberate patience, the way the land prepares itself for what comes next. She thought about seeds. She thought about the kind that needed a cold winter to break open and begin. She thought about what it meant to start something in the ground and then wait. Not passively, but with intention, tending what you could reach and trusting the rest to the season. She looked at the garden until she could no longer tell where the soil ended and the snow began. She did not look at the space between them in the kitchen, but she was aware of it. The way you are aware of a door that has come slightly open in a room where all the other doors are closed. She was not ready to say what it meant, but she had stopped pretending she didn't notice it.